All right, let's move on to our wonderful analytical exam. This is the final piece of the puzzle. This is the thing that you guys might be wanting to know the most about, the thing that is causing the most anxiety in many of you. So we're going to chat about what this is going to look like and be talking in a little bit more detail about the analytical essay itself, its structure. But, of course, you guys guessed it, a little bit of a warm-up. So let's take some time now to write down as many aesthetic features as you can think of. Now, some of you might be feeling a little bit confident about this. You're like, okay, I've been doing analysis work for the past, 10, 11 years of my life. I know some aesthetic features. Well, let's see, how many can you get down? If you like, you can pop them down into the Q&A chat. See if you can go quickly. See how many unique ones you can think of. I'm sure all of you can think of metaphor. But what else? What else is there? You can also take this opportunity to have a little munch and crunch, have a little sip of water. Make sure you're staying hydrated. All right, 30 seconds. How many more can you get down? If you haven't been sharing them, maybe count up your list and share the number in the Q&A chat, how many you got down. It would be definitely interesting to see. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, let's talk the elements of a good analytical essay. So in 2019, again, a million years ago, the QCEE, the Queensland Curriculum and Assessment Authority, conducted a bunch of trial exams to basically see if the ATAR system was viable and to see how students responded to taking external exams. In their English pursuits, when they were doing them for the English subject, their key findings for good essays were as follows. Number one, and most importantly, it's this, daylight and everything else, students need a clear and consistent thesis to do the best that they can. It's as simple as that. The thesis is the golden element of the essay. If a student does not have a thesis, if it's not a good thesis, if it's not adhered to, then they're not going to do well. You can write all the beautiful analysis in the world, you can have excellent audience positioning, but if you're not constantly referring back to your thesis, if you're not linking your evidence and analysis back to your thesis, then you're not going to do well. So thesis is vital. Number two, students need to demonstrate a deep understanding of the whole text. So we're not just talking about one particular scene, one particular chapter, one particular plot element. You need to demonstrate that you have a solid understanding of the play or the novel or the novella in its entirety. And then finally, students need to be constantly referring to audience positioning, drawing on the specific cultural attitudes, values, and beliefs of that audience. So it could be both the traditional audience, so the audience that the text was originally written for, as well as contemporary audiences, us here today in the 21st century. So audience positioning is something that can be a little bit overlooked. People are talking a lot about their analysis and then forget to be linking things to the audience positioning. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that audience positioning a little bit later on. So those are the three elements that the QCEE are really pushing, and this is so important to be aware of this because they're the people that are going to be marking your external exam. So we're going to go through three key and very common mistakes that students make when it comes to writing their analytical essays. Number one is synthesis. So it is very rarely a student's ideas that end up losing them marks in an essay, but rather tying themselves up in knots with complicated sentences and not letting their ideas flow together. This is why planning time in an essay-based exam is so important, having all of your ideas down in their entirety on a planning page before you start writing. Not having your ideas down means that people typically jump around, move from idea to idea, and then things don't flow. Audience positioning is sometimes chucked in as a last minute thought and it doesn't really connect in the way that you would like it to. So having that planning really set and clear before you start writing is really important. Number two is assuming. So students typically think that, oh, everyone's made that logical jump, or yes, everyone knows that this is what this thing means, when in reality, some people are not going to make those same connections that you are, and students then fail to sort of state what they might consider to be the obvious. You need to assume when you are writing this piece that you are the smartest person in the room. You know this text better than everyone, which means you have to be teaching people as you go. You need to be stepping people through your logic and showing them where the connections are that you've made. Teachers and markers are going to love this. They love to see that you have connected all of the dots really explicitly. You might remember when I mentioned all the way back at the top of our session talking about cohesion and connections, that it's really important to be just being really explicit with the connections, making sure that things are clearly going together logically. Logic is most important there. Then finally, spelling and grammar. It is just typical that exam conditions are going to bring out the very worst in your spelling and grammar. This is a sad fact of life. I have definitely suffered from it yourself. myself, but you don't want these things to be the things that are marking you down. So it's really important that you give yourself enough time at the end of the exam to be going back carefully, going through your work and marking your mistakes, fixing your mistakes, clearing your mistakes. Now, this could be as explicit as having your pen and running it along the sentence like this, checking every word, checking every full stop, comma, quotation mark, all of these sorts of things when you are writing. All right. So these are the most important elements. These are the most important ingredients to a good analytical essay. The thesis we talked about earlier, which is also known as your position or your argument, and it acts as the answer to the given question. So it's really important in your thesis that you're using the explicit language from the question in your thesis. It's just a very clear and simple way of indicating to the marker that you're answering the question directly. Then you have your evidence, which of course is picked in order to argue your thesis. This might come in the form of key quotes, structural devices, or aesthetic features. Now, in this task, you're going to be asked to memorize this evidence. You don't get that quote page that you did for your first analytical task of the year. So definitely be thinking about memorizing your evidence sooner rather than later. If you're trying to be memorizing your evidence in sort of the week before the external, where there are lots of other things going on, including other external exams, you're going to be in a rush, you're going to be in a panic. So the earlier you can start memorizing your evidence, the better. Then you have your analysis. This is about digging below the surface, peeling back the layers, unpacking the evidence in order to aid proving your thesis. And then we have our audience positioning, of course, and this talks about how all those other elements that you've discussed prompt the audience to think, feel, or react. So those are your important elements of an analytical essay. So when you're writing the meat of your essay, the body paragraphs of your essay, each of those elements from the slide before are plugged into a reoccurring flow or a reoccurring formula. So you start off with what, which is the evidence. So you plug your evidence in there. Now your evidence needs to be contextualized within the context of the plot of the story. So you're not using page numbers or act numbers or scene numbers or anything like that. You contextualize it using the plot. So prior to King Hamlet or old Hamlet's ghost appearing, Hamlet laments, insert evidence. Then, so what? This is your analysis. What does this evidence mean? So how does this evidence prompt audiences to think, feel, or react? And it's important that how does this evidence with the analysis that I've just talked about prompt the audience to think, feel, and react? So now, how does this link back to my thesis? And it's so important to be linking back to your thesis. Now, you use this formula every time you introduce a new piece of evidence. So within a body paragraph, you could be using this formula 2 to 3 times. Now, it's such a useful thing to be doing because it allows you to be using that synthesis. You see those arrows that are linking everything nicely together. So definitely be using these. And it can also be really helpful during your planning time when you're pulling all of your ideas together. Now, in your planning time, you should typically have a thesis, all of your evidence, your topic sentences, and even some ideas of your audience positioning as well. We'll talk a little bit more about planning time a bit later. All right, so this is an example of a analytical essay paragraph, body paragraph. This is the question, and this is the thesis that the author of this has used. So it says, disguise is used by Shakespeare to comment on the manipulation of truth in The Winter's Tale. To what extent do you agree? And the thesis that has been prompted by this question is, as such, Shakespeare manipulates the recurring symbolism of disguise to offer comment on truth as only ever temporarily hidden. So you can see how you've got Shakespeare clearly used across both, you've got manipulation across both, you've got truth across both, and you can see how that thesis is really explicitly answering the question. Now, I don't know if we're going to have time to go through this in detail, but we can probably show how I will talk about how this formula is used here. So you can see, first up, we have the contextualization of the evidence. To reassure himself of the legitimacy of his son, King Leonidas searches for his own likeness in the face of his young son, Mamilius. Then we have our evidence, our what. What has smutched thy nose? And smutched basically just means dirties. What has dirtied your nose? They say it is a copy out of mine. So what? What does this mean? What's the analysis here? Shakespeare's use of Mamilius and Leonidas' shared nose is twofold. Firstly, it demonstrates the two are truly related, as traditional audiences would understand that physical likeness was the only indication two people related at the same time of the play's writing. So we've got analysis mixed in with audience positioning there. And secondly, Shakespeare suggests that it is not merely the shape of the nose that they share, but its dirtiness also. Leonidas fails to keep his nose clean by delving restlessly into the intricacies of Polynixes and Hermione's relationship, and he is so eager to find betrayal that his nose has become dirtied by his actions. So there is your analysis there. And then we have more audience positioning, as well as linking back to your thesis at the end. As such, audiences are positioned to see that the truth of filial relation and evil action can be found within a character's face. Nice. All right, so a couple of tips about essays. Always plan your essays. So important. A lot of students think they can get away with just smashing out an essay, no worries, unbothered, but it often results in clunky writing. It often results in people jumping around with their story, with their essay, and not sticking to a solid line of reasoning. So take all of the time you need, both outside and within an exam room, to write out a full plan. Thesis, topic sentence, your segues, and your evidence before you even put a word on the page. Also, within an exam room, having a plan beside you will help you fend off writer's block and ensures that you're not trying to hold all of the memorized information in your head as you synthesize arguments into sentences. So because you have to memorize all of your evidence for this task, getting all of that evidence down onto the page at the start means you're not taking up valuable brain space trying to hold onto that while you're writing your piece. Number 2, always refer back to how the text audience is being positioned. So it's super important to note not only how the text is sharing a message, but how that message is being interpreted by the audiences that viewed it. This means you need to refer to both traditional and contemporary audiences. You don't need to refer to both in every paragraph, but they should be mentioned within the essay. Both should be mentioned within the essay. And this will also demonstrate how the meaning and interpretation of the text has changed over time. Number 3, don't be afraid to write simple sentences. The golden rule with analytical essays is clarity over complexity. You can use the best and fanciest vocab in the world. You can use long, beautiful, winding sentences. But if the marker doesn't understand what your key argument is or doesn't feel like you're developing your thesis throughout, you're not going to get a good mark. So clarity is the most important. Number 4, if you don't know what to write next, that's okay. Leave a gap. Come back to it later. The last thing you want is to try and push through that panic and write something that doesn't fit or you're not proud of. So instead, leave a gap, come back to it later. That's totally fine. When you're finished writing, edit your work. I understand the compulsion to just hand the exam in and run out of that room and never think about it again, but you don't want to get marked down over silly things like spelling or punctuation. So edit really carefully, read all the way through. If you have time, read through it twice, and try and make the most of your preparation time before you get in the exam room to try and avoid those little details. So for example, if you're studying something like Shakespeare, which often has some very strange names in them, like for example, Polynixes, then take some time to ensure you know how to spell them beforehand, so that's not going to be a problem in the exam room.